Um, well, it gives me great pleasure to be here to have a conversation with Aamer, who is one of the important pioneers of contemporary English short story by writers of Pakistani origin. His extensive work includes a novella, Another Gulmohar Tree, which was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Award. He's written over 10 story collections, including 37 Bridges, which was recipient of the KLF Fiction Prize in 2016. And he's written a novel, The Cloud Messenger, and edited an anthology of Pakistani women's fiction, Hoops of Fire, mostly translations. Recently, he has also started to write in Urdu. Aamer grew up in Karachi and migrated to England in his early teens. But he continues to maintain strong links with Pakistan and his readers here. Hermitage is his 5th collection to be published locally. In an earlier collection, Cactus Town, which is also published here, there were several stories which were then compiled by his London publisher into a new book called Turquoise. At other times, his collections such as Insomnia have been published in Pakistan and Britain in the same year. And Under the Gulmohar Tree, set in Karachi, is available in a Pakistani edition. Aamer's fiction is enriched by his extensive engagement with the literary traditions of the West and the subcontinent, and so much of his work is replete with a myriad of intertextual references and literary influences. This is how the American critic Bruce King describes him. Hussein is the heir of a tradition of writing that began in Persian, found expression in Hindustani and Urdu. That is the romantic sadness, the self-conscious artistry, the inserted tales, the indirection, even the imitation and continuation of older forms and conventions. Many writers from this tradition are quoted, cited. He is a complex and sophisticated writer. Hermitage reveals all this and much more in 13 stories. His first story, The Wounded Swan, is very unusual because it has been through what I can only describe as different literary processes, for lack of a better phrase. This was the first story, I think, that Aamer wrote in Urdu, and it was published in Asif Farrukhi's journal, Dunyazad. Is that right? Yes, okay. This story was translated into English as The Swan's Wife and became the title story alongside others written originally in English in Aamer's new collection in 2014. But now, this very story assumes new life in Hermitage with a new and rather beautiful translation as The Wounded Swan by Aamer's publisher, Shabano Alvi. And interestingly, while it draws on an Urdu legend, it's actually set in London and tells of a young woman whose family migrated to Britain from Central Europe. The many stories and many worlds that Aamer inhabits and his multiculturalism emerges in other works such as Bridges, which is set in Paris, has a Turkish protagonist, and yet it maintains its subcontinental link. Aamer goes on adding to this, layer upon layer throughout the collection, which has 2 very different stories drawn on the Layla Majnun legend. He then reworks well-known fables to advantage in 3 tales from Rumi and another tales from Attar, both deeply symbolic and indeed timeless and rather magical. As is the metaphorical title story, which tells of 2 monks and the rules governing the singing of devotional songs. One of my favorite remains Lady of the Lotus, which is inspired by Aamer's mother and her love for classical music, while Annie is a wonderful creative memoir revolving around Qurratunain Haider, a family friend. I'd also like to say that during the course of this evening, the images that appear on screen during the readings are those which are actually in the book. This is the very first time I have seen photography and fiction put together in this way in a Pakistani publication, a Pakistani work of fiction. Although this has become the norm in several works published abroad now, And though I discovered rather recently that it was actually used almost a century ago in Virginia Woolf's Orlando. So now, without further, I shall ask Aamer to read, I think.
Are you going to suggest any particular title?
No, I think he's reading Dove. Yes, yes.
Well, talking about images, many of them are by me, like that one. Several are by Shahban. This particular one in Dove is by Bina Shah, a novelist friend of mine. We did it one morning, and I just asked her if she could send it to me for a story. And it came along, she saw the story, she approved it the way it is. Yes, so it's a very, very short one. Many of the stories in this book are very short.
They're just running the stories, you see. This is not the dove. But I expect the dove will appear at some point.
Sorry, can I just check the mic if it's... Yes. It's called. Sorry.
Better? Any sound? No? No? Now? Often on those long afternoons in the old house in Badayon, when sunlight spread golden carpets on the stones and the older women had taken in the washing, and the children were tired of playing hopscotch in the open courtyard or leaping from balcony to balcony, the girl would go to the terrace and shelter in a stone pavilion with a novel or write couplets in a notebook, and then, as if she'd invited it over, the dove would begin to call her from a tree, and its call would lie like a shadow on her skin, but she never saw the bird that gave her invisible company. For years after she left and crossed borders and moved houses in Karachi, then Lahore, and then Pindi, and back to Karachi, and was known as the country's queen of melancholy verse, she thought her invisible friend had abandoned her. Yet, yes, but once in a top-floor bedroom in a tall, empty house, and in Islamabad paralyzed by strikes and demonstrations against a corrupt regime, as she stood looking out of a window at a flowering jacaranda, she heard the dove's call from the tree's upper branches, and she wondered how its plaintive song could ever have seemed to her to be the harbinger of joys to come.
That would invite some questions.
Yes, well, the questions, but actually it invites a lot of questions, because when I first read it, I thought this is a story about migration. Then I realized, no, it's about creativity. And then I realized it's about migration, creativity, and passage of time, and it's about everything. So I want to know, how did this story evolve, and how do you compress all that into 2 paragraphs?
Is this working? Yes, it is. How did I compress it all into 2 paragraphs? This is an interesting question. I've been doing a lot of that recently.
Yes.
And I think there was a remark that was made long before I was ever aware of it, of the influence of Persian texts and old Urdu texts. I think we're very good at doing these extremely short stories. Whether they're biographies or chronicles or fables, they work extremely well. This story is actually stolen from about 2 pages in the memoir of a poet called Ada Jafri, a brilliant Urdu poet. And I just found the story so fascinating that I told it in my own words. And it's pretty much the way she tells it. But of course, as we always do when we steal, the end changes somewhat, and gives you a different message. I think she had a sense of homecoming when she heard the dove. In this, she has a sense of alienation. Compression is something that I've always been fascinated by, and I think that's why I like short stories. And then you wanted me to say something about whether it's about migration or not?
Well, yes, I was actually quite... yes, can I just expand? I was quite interested in the idea of, again, creativity, about migration, whether it's from here to England, and change, and then creativity, and how all these things link up. It can suppress creativity, or it can open it out.
We're all living in multiple places, either in our heads or in our bodies now. So I think actually talking about migration is becoming harder and harder. Even when I come to Pakistan, I can see someone whom I was meant to meet in Islamabad and instead met in Karachi a year and a half ago. So I think we're just constantly shifting. And this story too, I mean, the migrations it talks about are really within this country.
Yes.
And I mean, for me, I'm now living this life more or less between two countries. I'm coming back and forth from Pakistan so often, and I'm so much in touch with Pakistani cultural life, or literary life, that I really don't feel that I'm very far away. But of course, there was a time when I first moved away that it took me 10 years even to get back to South Asia. And at that time, of course, one had many more feelings of where one belonged, did one belong, where was home. And it was actually coming back to the subcontinent that made me write my first story, because it was a way of trying to uncover, I think, images that were lost somewhere, and like in an album that had been put in a bottom drawer and forgotten. And they had to be kept fresh. Creativity, does migration increase it? I don't know, that's an eternal question. I don't know, somebody I love very much, a much older woman, once said to me that she always felt out of place in the town she grew up in, though she'd always lived in the same place. She felt always that her destiny was to leave that place, and she did in the end.
Oh, really? Well, this actually brings us to another, what I said, one of my favorites, the Lotus story, which is actually also about creativity and passion.
Oh, yeah.
The Lady of the Lotus, and it's developed, as I said earlier, from your mother's diaries.
Yeah, literally it's it's just a transcription of my mother's diaries with little intercalations from her children. So it's very much a collective work.
Would you like to read it? Because I think Asif also has some questions
Is there a
on
particular
that.
section you like in that? You mentioned that there was a section you were very fond of in that story.
This is the portion that we thought about.
Yeah.
There is a reference to music.
Yes.
And is that towards the end of it, the story?
The section you decided on is the one on your voice, no?
Yeah, I seem to remember you telling me which.
Where is it?
That's the story. Yeah.
I wish we had a picture of your mother up there.
Is that one going to appear? Yeah. There she is. Yeah. So she appears. Yeah. So we had to sift through old family albums to find the right picture, the right image for.
Either you read the beginning,
Uh-huh.
or I thought this,
Okay.
which is your voice.
Okay, this is a section that's told in her children's voice.
Yes.
So it's up to you then to read the diary bits and see what you feel. Her children will remember the concerts in the garden on nights lit up by flares or by the moon. They remember the songs and remind her of them, when she sang what, and even the words and the melodies. They sat around her as she sang or listened from the open window. They learnt her songs like the grey African parrots in their aunt's big cage, half understanding the words. They delighted her by singing rags in the bath, but when she persuaded them to take formal lessons, all but her middle daughter would run away. They will remember her favorite book, The Lady of the Lotus, illustrated with classical miniatures, a story from her native Malwa of Baz Bahadur and the poet-singer Rupmati, whose melancholy verses their mother set to music and sang. Years later, her son will find her a copy of the book she lost in transit and find some of those verses. But it's a new edition. Had I but known what pain love would come, had I but known, I would have banished him by beat of drum, had I but known. Did the rain fall that year of 1963? None of them remembers now. They think it never came. They remember, though, that all the years she longed for rain and missed her native Malwa, and how she exulted when it finally fell.
It's a lovely passage. I think Asif has.
So I would like to ask you to talk a bit more about this story, and one is that how this sense of your mother's diary get transformed into a short story. How do you deal with this material, which is obviously written by another person? And then also in this text, which is obviously about rain, welcoming the rain and the effect of memory, and there is a relationship with the natural world, but also there is a sense of loss about women who were singing and performing, and that kind of thing became a lost cause or a lost presence in Karachi. Can you comment on that
Yeah,
first?
well, that is partly accidental. It's only that the diary ends at a certain moment. She writes a lot in the diary about the dissatisfaction she feels when she's singing, about constantly wanting to reach an epiphany, wanting to reach a moment of glory and not getting there. And she has a lovely ironic voice, my mother, and she keeps writing about how she was praised by her tutor, by her teacher, by her ustad, by my father, her husband, or when my father told her off for not singing well. But she's constantly unhappy with the way she sung. I think that's why she ends at a certain point. But it almost seems as a story that she's given up singing. And of course, if that's what the reader feels, that's beyond the page. But yes, I think it is about that kind of loss. But it's also about women trying, I think, to be creative in various ways while they bring up their children, while they have their social lives and so on. And what was the process? She found it in a drawer about 20 years ago, I think just after my father died, and she said, you might find this interesting. And in fact, there were lovely observations about singing, like the one where she says that your finger ought to be sore when you reach a high note or something like that. It's lovely. And I always wanted to do something with it, but was neither making a story nor a book. And then one day I just hit on this idea of trying to put those first-person passages into the third person in exactly her language, exactly her words. And as I did that, I then realized that the children should be commenting on it because we'd all read the diary as well. And that's how it came about. So it only took half a day. After all these years, it was half a day, yeah. Much of the work in this book has not taken more than half a day or a day. The editing takes much longer, but the actual stories
But there must have been a lot of preparation or compression of feelings or observations.
No, because it's all from the diary.
All from the diary.
Yeah, it's all from the diary.
In this one.
Yeah.
Okay, then just to pursue this kind of conversation, your mother's voice plays into another story which is not here, but a great favorite of mine, Oslamand. And you So I would like you to talk about that story and your mother's observations in very crisp Urdu, how they were used by you for fictional purposes in a language which you create and you make your own.
Yeah.
But obviously that comes from your mother.
That was just too funny because, she still has them, a kind of host of traveling, charlatans actually. They can do just about anything. They can lay carpets, they can change window screens, they can cook, they can make biryani, and of course they make promises which they don't keep. And there was one particular woman who was fascinating. In the end, she went up with a pearl necklace. And at the very end of the story, she's come to tell the lady of the house that she's getting married, but she's marrying a man with six children and another wife or something. And the narrator asks her, didn't you ask her any more about it? And she says, well, why should I? I'm not a custodian. I'm not God's little soldier. Khudai Fojdar. And then I gave her that story to translate into English later. I said, will you do it? Because, I can't. And she changed it around entirely. She added so much to it in terms of making the nameless mother figure have a name, making the nameless narrator have a character and an age, and so on and so forth. So I said, Mum, this is your story now. So she said, well, as long as I'm there as a translator, it's okay. So that was great fun. And I was asking you whether the translation conveys the spirit of the original, which I think it does. But.
Actually it does, but there are a couple of words which are lost. I love the way your mother calls those people kamchor.
Yeah, how do you say kamchor in English?
And how do you say khudai fojdar?
Well, she said God's little soldier. She actually said, when I asked her, Mum, what did you mean by that? She just goes, God's little soldier. Because she's completely bilingual. I've never come across somebody as completely bilingual as my mother. She can
Except
think,
one lady
read.
whom I should come to later on.
Yeah.
The great novelist.
Yeah, well, Mum used to criticize her English no end.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she did this translation of a book called The Nautch Girl. And Mother made a list of things and she said, Annie, this is journalese, please take it away. But it was too late.
Okay. On another note, in these stories, you are not only playing with memory, but you're moving across languages. And I wanted you to comment on that how do you get is there a particular voice which you use for Urdu? And how do you always aim at translating that into English?
No.
Or does that remain a separate, unconnected body of
Separate and unconnected, yeah. That's why I keep giving it to other people to translate. I tried first to translate one, you mentioned The Wounded Swan, it became into an entirely different story. I mean, the end is completely different. And people are remarking on how dramatic the end of the translation is, thanks to Shabano's very vital and lively translation. That end is just not there in the English version, just because I couldn't live through that scene again. I just kind of, the idea of it exhausted me. And then a couple of others I translated literally and handed to an English student of mine, a PhD student, who knew no Urdu at all. And she said she would make them polished enough for an English readership, not without any kind of jagged edges that seem to come from another language, which is what I do when I try to translate. And then my mother took 2 of the stories, including 37 Bridges. And by some fluke, in 37 Bridges, she's managed to sound exactly like my English voice. Which, by the way, I mean, my mother didn't like my first 2 or 3 books. She said, too sad, too glum. Why can't I have some fun here? Too angry. And then she started to like them, and I think, yeah, she got that voice beautifully well. But with my, collaboration, I think, full collaboration. And she didn't play around with 37 Bridges. She kept it quite close to the original, as you know, because you published it.
So let's move to another part of your work, and I guess Muneeza is going to ask you some questions about
Yes, well, I actually, for one thing, I wanted to, this Lady of the Lotus is set in Karachi.
Mm-hmm. Entirely, yeah.
Entirely. You have lots of stories set in Karachi,
Yeah.
which seem to capture.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us what Karachi is to you in a creative way, in terms of your stories, before I get on to the next question?
Well, of course, to begin with, it was childhood. And when one is a short story writer, one begins with Catherine Mansfield. So one always begins, one needs to do the childhood story to clear the air, as it were. So finally I came round to writing that story, Little Tales, which is now about 30 years old. And it was then translated into Urdu by Tamil Reyaz.
Yes, she loved it, I remember.
Yeah.
It's a marvelous story.
Yeah. And people thought it was autobiographical, and it isn't really. It's just autobiographical about the place it's set in.
Yes.
But none of the characters or anyone is anyone remotely like my family. And I continued to do it, but very often Karachi is woven into other stories because it's a place that I went back to in my mind, and then later on the place I started to return to physically. So there is something fascinating about it.
Karachi is also, it's come to this, this is one of my favorite books, is your novella, another Gulmohar Tree.
Yeah.
But there you're reversing it. A lot of your stories about people going to England, migrants, and here you reverse it. You've got a foreign woman, a British woman, and she's migrant. She's of Georgian origin. She marries a Pakistani.
Partly Georgian origin. Yeah.
She's a Briton of Georgian origin. She marries a Pakistani and comes to Pakistan and finds her sense of self, I think.
Yeah.
It's so. Can you tell us about this and what led you to this story?
I tell you what led me to the story was reading on a train from Southampton a story by Ghulam Abbas called Nek Larki or Naram Dil Larki or something like that. No. Yeah, something like that. Rehem Dil. It's about a man who meets a young woman in London at a dance, and they fall in love and marry, and he brings her back to Karachi, and there's nothing for them to do in the early 50s except open a dance school. And I began to think, I said, surely there would have been something else that they could do when they came back. And then I found the life of these characters in my story. And as I was reading it, I started to look for children's illustrations of the time. And I found a book by Ghulam Abbas called Chand Tara, I think, and it had illustrations by a Zainab Abbas. And I started trying to see who this Zainab Abbas was and found out she was actually partly Greek and partly Scottish and had been brought up in England. So that added some flavor to the book. But unfortunately, a very avid young critic, you know how academics are when they come to ask you things about your books, and they ask you with too much fervor about something, and they pick up a particular name and they insist on it. And she has said that this is inspired by Christian Abbas. It isn't, because I didn't know her story. I knew very little about her. It's just the flavor of their art, of the husband and wife, the short story writer and the artist, and the foreign woman who lives in Karachi. But I knew nothing about their lives. I later found out that, in fact, he had 2 wives and he was polygamous.
No, but
it would have been a completely different story had it been about them.
It had shades of Sarah Saleri's mother, and then it had shades of Esther Rahim.
Esther Rahim is much more in the other story, The Tree at the Limit.
Oh, is it? I didn't realize that. Okay.
Yeah. So it was very much just about the artistic world of that time.
No, because, but it captured that world. It captured the women's world and that whole life.
Yeah. It was the autobiographical part of that novella is again the area in which I live and my aunt's magazine. That, and also I described the neighborhood very closely because a few minutes away from me lived Laila Shahzada, so I used to actually watch her painting. I watched her paint that big green Buddha, and Nagi lived to the left. Yeah, so I was, walking distance from these 2 great artists without knowing that they were great artists. They were just, And then the Arts Council, with its being taught at the Arts Council what was abstract art and what was modern art by my parents, and I still can't make out the difference between those particular canvases we saw. Anyone who was here in the 60s will remember those exhibitions. huge canvases of black moons and red backgrounds and so on. So.
One of the things, before I hand over to Asif, I must ask you, you write about women, and you write about women's lives, and you write about them with such sensitivity in a way. Often when men write about women, I don't know where I was discussing this, and I saw some story and I read it, and I said, this is obviously written by a man. And the chap was very upset, and everybody said, why? And I said, well, it's just the whole way they describe the women, and they're always so seductive, and they never go beyond. If they want to do something, they're stuck and they're poor, they go and seduce somebody. Your women go and write poetry, they become needle women, they become artists, they do all sorts of things. Now, do you find
that does have something to do with growing up in Karachi and seeing a lot of women like that. I mean, Begum, Amina Majid Malik had PCHS right near the corner, right around the corner from us. Khadija Begum had Bambi.
Yeah.
I used to model for her as a kid. I used to wear, her fashions, children's fashion. I'm sure I have. Come on, I'm so old. I've mentioned a lot of things.
That's Kamil's mother, isn't it?
Yeah. I modeled for her till I was about 8, I think. Yeah, walking around a swimming pool in golden velvet shorts and a little waistcoat. Which I refused to wear ever after, but there was a rather grand green sherwani that I wore as well. So yes, I saw them stitching, I saw them painting. I mentioned seeing Laila Shahzada paint. And then there were people that one met casually, like Zevonista Hamidullah, and even Atiya Begum, who was we both remember meeting her at about the same time, before her death, Atiya Faizi.
Terrifying woman,
Yeah, terrifying woman. But I knew that she wrote all the time. And she was, about 100 or something? She was still writing about Cleopatra and the Asp. And,
I had no idea at all.
She was still writing articles. I mean, it was a world that was just full of creative people. And yesterday, one of your students asked me about something. And I said, well, being a Pakistani writer and writing either in English or Urdu didn't seem like a big deal to me because there were just so many around us. And they weren't terribly worrying about being published in the West. No one heard that Mumtaz Shah Nawaz was, for example.
Yeah.
And Ahmed Ali, of course, had published in England. But yes, it was a dynamic world to live in. Plus, Jamiluddin Ali, who you knew well, was a close family friend. So were others. So, Bukhari, Zed Bukhari.
Ahmed Ali.
He's related to me, he's married to mother's cousin.
Yes, but you're because of your use of and your familiarity with two languages. I don't know, you're sometimes described as the heir to...
Oh, there really isn't any similarities there.
No, I know
nothing
there
at all,
but
really
because,
none.
he was doing two languages and he moved between the two. You're often described in that way.
Yeah, well, I wrote in two languages because that person there and this person here, well, I decided me badgering me, so I did.
But you take no responsibility for what you've done.
Oh, you have to, because you gave me an exact and set agenda. I'm going to make it more fictional as I go along. But it was 5 stories with the same narrator, and then they basically all became stories about a man narrating a woman in some way or another. Very different ones, but and I did them in 3 weeks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
2 to 3 weeks.
Do you want to?
I want to talk about another very important woman whom we have not named as such. And this is, of course, Qurratullain Haider, who once asked you, Miyan tum Urdu mein kyun nahi likhte? And then you have this wonderful
Urdu
essay.
mein likhte ho is actually what she said.
Okay.
She was kinder, but I made it into
tell us
it.
that story.
Well,
and
when I
also,
met her
I would
after...
like you to read from the wonderful piece that you have.
It's a very difficult piece to read from, but let me try.
Would you like to read first, or should I ask you questions first?
Shall I read first?
Yeah, please.
Shall I? Please. Okay, this is towards the end of this. It is actually a piece of life writing. There are 2 such in this book. But I was told by people who read it that it read like a short story and that it didn't have a huge difference in voice from my fiction, which was flattering because I've always tended to separate life writing a lot from fiction. So this is... I last saw Qurratullain Haider in January 2006, so this is about that meeting, and she died a year later. And of course, we always carry huge regrets about things we don't do. Because I was back 3 months later for a literary festival. You were there as well, Kitab. And I didn't ring her and go to visit her. So, it's just too far away. She died in 2007, but I saw her in 2006, a year and a half. Yeah. Oh, I've actually marked something here. Actually, this, coincidentally, the passage I've chosen actually has her voice in it as well. There's a quote from one of her novels, and it's in her English, so that's an interesting permutation. We were in Delhi that winter, 2005-06. I'd worked all year in a new academic post at the University of London, was struggling to complete my 4th book of stories, and had decided to spend December with my sister who lived there. We all wanted to visit Ajmer, where Mother's mother was born. That summer, there'd been a series of explosions in London that had killed many and turned Muslim into a bad word, making even those of us who prized ourselves on pluralist ideals, secular politics and composite identities defensive when we were asked to explain the causes of our fellow Muslims' disaffection. I'd been commissioned to write about that for a Delhi local weekly and had started work on it almost as soon as I arrived. When they saw it in print, my Indian friends there protested, "Why did they label you a Muslim writer? Didn't you object?" I visited monuments I'd seen on my last trip, Humayun's tomb, Lodi Gardens, Jama Masjid with my brother-in-law who also took me to places I hadn't seen. The old fort, Jamia Millia, the pioneering educational establishment where novelist Saleha Abid Hussain and her husband had lived for many years, among many other young and progressive intellectuals. Annie had taught there when she moved to Delhi from Bombay. I came back with an armload of Urdu books that in the winter afternoons brought back a Delhi that was almost invisible now. Annie had heard from her publisher, Ritu Menon, that we were in town and hadn't been able to reach her on the number she'd given us. She'd rung it once. The trip from South Delhi to Noida was at least an hour long. On the way, as we drove along the banks of the Jamuna, Annie's loyal driver Haldar remarked, "The river has become a drain. Dhobis wash their laundry in its trickle and people grow watermelons and cucumbers on its bare bed." Annie was waiting in the veranda of her house, basking in the glow of the mild winter sun. Her welcome was loving, even expansive. A feast was laid out on her table. As we ate, I saw 2 generations of household retainers who had looked after her for years, in contrast to the Bombay flat I'd seen her in nearly 40 years before. Here she was surrounded by her drawings, her books, and her papers. A close relative lived nearby. The literary world that had given her increasing acclaim was a brief phone call away. I wondered whether in her years in Bombay, hardly the heartland of the rich syncretic culture she'd celebrated, she'd missed Karachi's artistic circles. She spoke about her friends there indulgently now. We shared a past in 3 countries and 2 languages. I'd read her obituary of Saleha Abid Hussain and reminded her how she'd written that Saleha Begum and her husband had now become an object of research for social historians, perhaps because the ideals and dreams of the earlier years of Jamia Millia had been forgotten. Animated, Annie told me how in her early years there she'd often visited Saleha Abid Hussain and spent long evenings listening to her discussing literature, politics and religion with her neighbor Anis Qidwai. In spite of their formidable erudition, Saleh and Anis had both been schooled at home and didn't have a university degree between them. "Have you read Anis Qidwai's diary, Azadi Ki Chhaon Mein?" she asked, a penetrating account of the effects of partition in Delhi, where hundreds of Muslims were refugees in their own country. They were herded into the old fort awaiting resettlement or transportation to Pakistan, where many of them didn't want to go. Anis Qidwai's husband was murdered during the riots, but she went on and worked with refugees. On the long drive away from that home she'd finally created for herself, I thought of Annie's words about that lost period of broken ideals. Last year she'd published her translation of her first novel, My Temples Too, originally published just after partition, when her memories of the events in Delhi from where she'd left for Pakistan were raw. There were young Muslim volunteers of Jamiatul Ulama in the camp, attending to casualties and carrying corpses. It was like living through a blood-curdling nightmare. Sayyid Iftikhar and his colleagues were either busy demoralizing the Muslims or taking the first opportunity to run away to the new dominion. Most of them had already gone, leaving their followers to face death. Corpses lay about in the street or rotted in the sun or became decomposed and swollen in the rain. The blood of the Muslim citizens of Delhi flowed in the streets, dripped into gutters and mixed with muddy rainwater. Now this was something she had written when she was 19 or 20. And the translation that she made later is exactly what she had written in Urdu. What had made her rewrite this book after nearly three decades? Had she witnessed those scenes at the age of 20? Did she leave for Pakistan in fear or in desperation or in hope of the promised new dawn? Had she spent much of her life answering those questions in the voices of her characters and remained silent about her own feelings?
So this is a fascinating piece of writing. And Aamer, I had questions about the technique that you have used here, because you describe it as an essay about Quratul and Haider, and it sounds like a story. So it could be both an essay as well as a story,
Yeah.
A non-fiction story. where would you classify it, or is there a need to classify writing
Well,
as original as this?
I wrote it as a memoir for Critical Muslim or life writing, and nothing at all is invented. And like Annie, and something that she probably taught me to do, I have a very strong visual and audio memory. So I can remember entire conversations, as some of you probably know, and also pictures, and I can find lost things because I've spotted them from the corner of my eye without realizing I've done so. So I wrote this, and I think she would love it, except that she did have this habit when for example, when she launched River of Fire in London, she said, I chose a passage, and she said, Mia, don't read anything about Pakistan. So she did have these little things, but other than that, she was very happy to go along with all sorts of stuff. I think she would have loved it, and probably told me to delete a couple of passages, but maybe she wouldn't. But then she herself was an absolute artist at writing things that were both fiction and non-fiction. Like, I know 2 stories. I think Jin Bolo Tara Tara, which is absolutely pure memoir, and yet it reads like a short story. Yeah, it reads like a couple of other things. She told me this is not a story, actually. It was a bit of memoir. So I don't make that fast distinction. I might have done a while ago, but at the moment I don't really care about it. I sent it to Shabano to see whether she would like it, and just because I thought you would like the piece, and you said it's going into the book, isn't it? Yeah. So we decided, and she said she didn't see the difference between the storytelling voice and the non-fiction voice.
So it gels into the book very well.
Yeah.
And I was, what you were saying about Quratul and Haider, there are her writings such as Dalanwala, in which you're not sure if the world is fiction or it's an essay, and maybe it's both. So is that something which she tried and then you developed it on your own, or was that a conscious influence?
No, it wasn't a conscious influence.
Has she influenced you as a writer?
Yes, she has influenced me as a writer. No, it's not a conscious influence. In this story, obviously, because it's about her, it tends to get very close to her own tone of writing, in English, in fact. There's a kind of flowing thing she has. When she wrote about her father, she's very good at connecting sequences. Though this is chronological, her work tends not to be chronological. So yeah, obviously there's the shadow of Annie on this one. What stories of hers have influenced me? I can't say that a particular story I've written has been inspired by something she's done, except for one called Two Men on a Stormy Afternoon, which I think you translated into Urdu. Yeah, that's closely based on a story that she told me I would love, which was called Ek Makalma, and she had wanted me to translate it. So that was a tribute to her. Other than that, I think that book of hers called Patchar Ki Awaaz is my favorite of her work.
You said something very interesting about that book and how you rate it very highly. And I wonder if you could repeat that comment. What do you think of Patchar Ki Awaaz?
Yeah, I think Patchar Ki Awaaz is one of the most amazing accounts of someone who's migrated from India to Pakistan. It's done so casually. It kind of puts across all the tragedy of that time in such in such a completely laconic voice that shows how people could be actually deadened to the pain of that move. Or for some people, how casual it was. But it's just the voice and the way she manages to do a first-person voice that's nothing like her. When the woman says something like, I know nothing about science, I know nothing about art, I'm a scientist and a mathematician, I don't read fiction, etc. And there was Quratul and Haider, who did almost nothing but read fiction all the time. It's just a stunning story. But that Jalawatan, which she had written in English as The Exiles and the year I was born, in fact, I found out, is an amazing account of how different kinds of exile parallel each other. You have Indians and Pakistanis who can't meet on the same ground in London because they carry their hostilities with them. We had been told that Indians and Pakistanis who met in London were very close and very united, but she shows these rivalries and animosities coming through even in the BBC cafe and so on. And then she ends on this scene, which is the most stunning post-war scenes I've ever read, when people are going to a church, midnight mass, and the Polish, Czech refugees. And the people who are watching them, the South Asians from their windows, are feeling the same melancholy and the same pain as those Eastern European refugees, which is quite stunning, absolutely beautiful. And I read that. I was asked to talk about my favorite books at the British Library some years ago. And I read that, in the mostly Anglo-Saxon audience was completely bowled over. They said, who is this writer and why can't we read her in England? So we got together, Alice Albinia, who I think some of you know because she's written a book about Pakistan. I edited a book of her short stories together. We got permission from various people, including her Indian publisher, Ritu Menon. And the book was just dropped at the last minute by Hyperion. You know Hyperion, the lovely little books? Yeah, you can still see it on Amazon. They just rang me up and they said, sorry, this book is not going to sell. So.
Maybe you should have offered it to Sherbano, who would have published it. I just want to move to another piece of writing which brings up this question of the essay and memory, fiction and non-fiction. And when you write about a character who's not, or a person, not a character, who's not as well known as Quratul and Haider, and that's Uncle Rafi.
Yeah.
So can you talk about who that Uncle Rafi is and why do you link or relate with his story or stories?
Why do I relate with his story? Because I think when I started to write short stories myself, my aunt, who's now dead, who lived in Bombay and was very friendly with Ismat Chughtai, in fact, and with Sajjad Zaheed, told me, you do know you had a great uncle who wrote stories. And I said, yes, I think I did know that. And he wrote a book called Kehkashan. And in fact, my sister's daughter was named Kehkashan by my grandmother, though she was never called that. And for years and years, I wanted to find what this book was, but there was also this romantic story that used to go on about him, about how at the age of 33, at the peak of what might have been a very promising career, he was a fine short story writer. He just blew out one day. He was just found dead in a bathtub. And so, of course, there were many legends surrounding that. And of course, there was a love story, which I'm now, after all these years, allowed to tell. He had fallen in love with a cousin and felt that, as a kind of vagabond writer and radio announcer and so on and so forth, he didn't have the courage to propose to her. And sometime later, she married somebody he knew well, and he was dead. So that was it. You know how we have these stories with long blank spaces between them, which are left for us to fill in? And I've always been fascinated by that. So I just put it down exactly as I know it, with, again, no embellishments at all. It's just, that's life, that story.
It's a fascinating story.
Yeah, and then, of course, you found the book for me. I think your father had it. Yeah. So one day, I just got this big parcel in the post, and I opened it, and it said at the back, Dr. Asif Aslam. And there was Kehkashan photocopied from start to finish, and that was in the year 1997. So I discovered my great-uncle through that, and just some of the stories are quite beautiful. Some that I was told by my uncle, another uncle, much later, that there are stories in the book that he would never have allowed to be reprinted, and that there are missing stories that somebody called Qaisi Rampuri just stole and published under his own name. So, yeah, I suppose it happens. So somewhere there are. And there was also a legend about how one whole paragraph of Hajra Masroor's, one of Hajra Masroor's stories, is just lifted directly from his. But we never found out what story that was. But somewhere there is a bowdlerized passage. But I think we all tend to do that sometimes. We steal each other's passages. So that's Uncle Rafi. But I just wish I had known I had a writing great uncle, or I had a copy of the book when I was much younger.
So Muneeza, I'll move over to you because there's another reading that you'd like to invite.
Well, I would have a couple of things before we go to the reading, because the reading is, you're going to be reading by Attar, aren't you? Yes.
Yeah, you'd like me to?
I'd like you to, but I just want to ask you a couple of questions. I don't know if they're interlinked. For one thing, you write a lot about suppressed emotions, trauma, and in stories like The Lake and The Hermitage, things that, and a lot of these.
Those are all my young men stories. I'm always told how well I write about women, but these are all people who are sort of below the age of 25 or 20 even. And a lot of young men recognize themselves in them. So yeah, it's fun.
But a lot of your interest in fables also. They also deal with the unsaid of things that are suppressed. Do you not feel that? Is that related to your interest in fables or not? No. So
fables are completely different. Fables just draw me. They fascinate me. And I think I have already told Asif, so I can give away a secret. When I'm asked how I choose my stories from the Masnavi or from Attar's collections, and I don't usually take them from the Conference of the Birds, I take them from Lives of Saints and the Divine Book, Elahi Name, which I read in Persian, and then I read French versions just to be sure that I'm okay with the Persian. Not in English ever, because I don't want to be influenced by anybody else's English pattern. What I do is I just flick through the book, put a feather there, put my finger on a story and read that and see if it's going to work. Mostly it does, and that's how I do those ones. And they come out in...
Like Fal. Why don't
Yeah,
you
it
tell
is-
the
it
whole
is
story
Fal.
so that I don't have to ask you later?
It is false. I mean, the other day I did this with Attar when I decided I wanted to do 7 stories by Attar, and I chose 7. I did only 5 in the end. And they all really connect to one concept, which is adab. It's all about the making of perfecting of not just the soul, but one's ethical character, I think, rather than love. Whereas all the Masnavi stories were about romantic love and the pursuit of romantic love, and disappointment, actually. 2 of those are about severe disappointment. That was what attracted me about them, that they were about marriages that fell apart, or love that didn't succeed. Or, love that was unfulfilled because the dream of that love was greater than its possible or imminent fulfillment.
Well, would you like to read us from Attar, and then we will take it from there?
Yeah. I have to say that for 24 years or so, Attar has been my great favorite, and someone I return to all the time when I'm looking for inspiration. Sorry, I've only seen this book yesterday, so I'm not quite familiar yet with where everything is. Yeah, I found it. I actually like the one about the birds.
Okay.
Or you like the dog one?
Well, up to you. Yes, we talked about the dog, but you
Yeah,
can read whichever one you
I'll
like.
just read the
Actually, we're
first
quite happy.
A Sufi in his robe of wool was walking down the road when a dog approached him in hope of a scrap of food. He hit the creature with his cane and broke its back. The dog went baying and barking down the street to Abu Zayeed, known for his sagacity, to ask him for justice. How could you bear to hurt a helpless creature, the wise man said to the Sufi. It's the damn dog's fault. I hit him because he soiled my robe. But the dog went on howling. Abu Zayeed said, what can I give you to soothe your pain? The dog replied, wise master Abu Zayeed, when I saw that man wore a Sufi's robe, I trusted him without ever believing he could harm me. If he hadn't worn the robe, I'd have avoided him. If you want to punish him, strip that robe from his back. It's reserved for those who walk on the right path. No one will then be duped by his appearance. There's another very short one that I'd like to add to that. So I'm just showing you how these stories all appeared in a sequence that seemed to echo each other. Sheikh Junaid had a disciple whom he favored above all the others. This made the other disciples jealous. Junaid, with his understanding of hearts, ordered 20 caged birds to be brought to him. He summoned his disciples and said, each one of you must now take a bird to a place where no one can watch you, kill the bird, and bring it back to me here. The disciples went away, killed the birds, and each one brought back a cadaver, all but the favorite, who returned with a living bird flapping its wings on his wrist. Why did you not kill it? Junaid asked. Forgive me, but Master Junaid, you told us we should choose a place from where no one watches, but God was watching me everywhere I went. Junaid smiled. The other disciples listened in wonder and bowed their remorseful heads.
What a beautiful story.
They're lovely stories. Sorry.
How would you like nice then?
Maybe we could have a last couple of questions and then open the floor.
So, yes.
Aamer, I wanted to ask you about your fascination with the fable as a form. Is it because of the precision it has, and how you have drawn, not only, we've talked about how Urdu short stories have influenced you, but here is a completely different world of the Persian fable, the great Persian classics. And that is a great, and also maybe talk about Shah Latif. So these Sufi poets and saints, they inspire you in several ways. And I'd like you to talk about that. Tell us how that inspiration
It's
works.
such a cliche to say this, but it was around me. I mean, my father is Sindhi, my mother is from North India. But my father also had very good Urdu, so much as I don't understand Sindhi very well, I just always heard those stories. I mean, particularly the Sassi and Momal and Rana. In fact, my mother wrote a version of Momal and Rana for children, which was a rather dark story to tell, because my father had told it to her. And on my mother's side, I was really taught to recite the Masnavi by my mother and my grandmother when I was 15. So that particular story that was very, very, very prominent in my mind was Majnun, when he's sitting on the sand and writing with his finger, and someone passes by and says, what are you doing? And he says, I can't see Leila, so I make love with her name. I write her name over and over again in the sand. And then by pure coincidence, somebody who became a very close friend of mine, Shusha Gappi, who was an Iranian singer based in Britain, actually chanted this on an album. And I heard it and said, but I know this because, it was fascinating. So those stories, like a lot of fables, came to me actually through poetic versions or verse versions, which is, of course, what Shah Abdul Latif does and what so many others do as well. They tell you a whole story in narrative verse. That always fascinates me. I used to sing a lot of them. I learned to sing Heer when I was 17. So I didn't know any Punjabi, but I got someone to teach me how to do it. So I've actually read through the whole of Varid Shah's Heer at the age of 19, actually. I lie, not 17. I think I learned the first part of Heer at 17. So yeah, it was always very close. I also love French and Italian, but particularly French ballads. So a lot of those are stories, and then Scottish ballads as well. So that's probably been the greatest influence on me as a storyteller, I think.
Poetry in a musical form and poetry with storytelling.
And that tight kind of story that's told in 6 verses or 7. I don't know how many verses a ballad is meant to have, but do you remember Joan Baez used to sing a lot of them when I was a child? The really dark ones, the Rose and the Lindsay, where this woman kills her 2 kids and they come back to haunt her. Tell her that she's going to hell. I think those things were always in my mind. And when I started to write, that's what I wanted to write. But I had no ability to do it. I could only write really boring, mundane, realistic stuff. So it took me years to be able to get to do that properly. And now I can just, carry on forever. All I need to do is to open, one of the books of the great. I don't really like the word Sufi very much at all. But those great mystic poets, and take their stories and just retell them with hardly any difference at all. They hardly need any editing. And I'm old enough not to want to write something original anymore. So life writing and fables it is. I think it's a good balance.
So the last question from my side, and I hope that while I'm doing this question, we can change the slides, is this relationship with image and words. And again, how this is a very different shape the book has taken, and how do photographs or images add to the meaning of the words, and why did you choose this kind of thing?
I've come to feel recently with the last 2 books, and I think Bina and I were having this conversation last year in this very room, that particularly a short story collection is very much a collaborative effort. And in this particular instance, last year or the year before, I had someone who had attended a creative writing workshop of mine that I did for 4 days. And she was a very fine poet herself, an American who lives in Wales. And she said, there are 2 things. You have some stories in one of your books that have never appeared in England in book form. And another thing which I'll suggest to you later. I said, yeah, you can have them. She says, I don't have a penny. All I can do is publish it and give you 27 copies of the book. And you can sell them. And I said, well, yeah, fine. And then she said, but this might find very funny, but since I'm your Facebook friend, I love the pictures you take on your BlackBerry on the street. And they were just for fun, cherry blossoms and lakes and swans and all kinds of things. She said, can I use some of them? I said, yeah. So those pictures went in. And some friends sent me pictures which also went in. But some of the stories that she'd originally wanted in that book went out because she had only 65 pages. And there had to be pictures, full color pictures, in fact. And I was writing new stories. I had written enough new stories so that when we sifted through them, we only used about 3 from the previous book. And the one that she was really in love with was called 9 Postcards from Sanlúcar de Barrameda, and that never went in the end. And that was actually a story with photographs, and that was my idea. So you've made me rediscover something. I had actually published that story with the collaborator and her photographs. So my pictures went into this, and then when the book came to Pakistan because people wanted it, and I had to bring it myself because it was not something that my publisher could do. Shabano Alvi, who is a friend and a colleague, looked at it and she said, I think we should have a similar Pakistani version, but she was adamant from the beginning that it was not going to be exactly the same book, and that it was going to be twice the length and have completely new photographs than they'd be in black and white. Now she also happens to be a photographer, painter, an artist, a designer, and all sorts of other things. So the cover's by her, the back is by her, and some of the photographs are by her. So that was really a collaborative effort. We spent, I think, 3 months doing the whole book. That's it. And in that there were photographs, there was a translation she did of the Wounded Swan, there were discussions about stories. There were trips back and forth between England and Pakistan discussing the book and what it was going to look like and so on. And this is what's emerged. So I was just lucky that two publishers were interested in visuals and pushed me to kind of match my visuals to stories. And sometimes we argued quite a lot about which visual matched which story. Sometimes I won, sometimes they did. I got my bridge in the end, didn't I? You wanted that bridge out for some reason. Yeah. That's it.
So should we open the floor for discussion? So we can take questions from the audience, but with a small, that this should be a question and not a speech.
Yeah.
And Aamer, only you are allowed to do storytelling, not people raising questions.
Oh, by the way, I have to say that I get a lot of people asking me about theory all the time. What theory do you think matches this kind of fiction? And which theorist should we read to understand your fiction? I say, for God's sake, read the story, read it carefully. I'm sure you can write about it. I mean, I don't think that studying English necessarily has to be based on which theoretician says what about which writer. So, anyway, welcome questions. Well, you can ask me, but you won't get a very good answer. So
I guess I'll just take the lead here. No, it's fine. You guys can do the right.
yeah, I can.
Like I said, just coming straight to the question. So in Pakistan and Karachi, there are a lot of aspiring writers as well. And even when I speak to them, there is this one perception in their mind that when it comes to writing, or especially when it comes to writing fiction, it's a very, very tedious process. So as a writer, I'm sure you have tons of experience with that. What do you think that is it something very simplistic? It's something very
That it's a tedious process. Well, I think each writer thinks very differently. Some people just love writing and feel alive only when they're writing. Some people feel it's a drudgery, which is why I write such short stories, because, I mean, the idea of getting stuck in a novel, which I've done only once in my life, was just hell. I hated it. I mean, the continuities and so on. So, but yeah, writing these little bursts that come on me is delightful. But yeah, I have found it tedious to write. And actually, more than the tedium of writing is a tedium of thinking about writing. When will you get to that table? When will you write that first line? Will it lead you to where you want to go? Or a story that starts going wrong halfway or pear-shaped. Even a half-page story can go wrong sometimes and be discarded. But I think there is a degree of tedium for some of us, yes. I mean, who wants to be stuck in one room doing the same thing day after day after day?
Aamer, it's Asif. I'd like to ask you, how long will you hide behind yourself in a fiction? We would like to read your memoirs in a form of non-fiction.
It's something I've thought about from time to time, and I even accepted a contract to do it at one point. But I have a very good friend who's a Scottish novelist called Sheena Mackay, and I think she's finally writing her memoirs at 75. And she told me, what happens is that if you write about yourself, you put on paper those aspects of yourself which you've saved for your fiction. See, as far as it's writing about other people, I'm very happy to do it and be this kind of semi-nameless narrator who talks about himself in connection with that particular subject. But trying to kind of follow my life from beginning to end. I was born in Karachi in 1955, but I'm not sure actually. My mother says I was born in PCHS, and my father says I was born in Clifton, and I know both houses where I was born, and one of them is now, I think, it's the Russian consulate or something like that. I know I lived there till I was 6 months old, but my mother says that for some reason I was born in PCHS, so I don't even know really, and I don't have a birth certificate. Should I say all these things in a memoir? No, I think I would get bored. He will write my biography and I'll write his. How about that?
I don't have a contract on it.
No. But I appeared as a character in one of his books. I come in and out on his London trip, talking about going off to Palestine and telling him, forcing him to meet A.S. Bayat, grabbing him by the ear and dragging him to meet.
You're not a fictional character. You are.
I'm me.
I
am me. Yeah. But it is narrative. No. So for now, no autobiography.
Your piece in Dawn that was published about your journey of writing, right? It was really riveting and it was so intriguing. So it sort of made me understand that you're a better non-fiction writer as well, which is really much.
Yeah, I enjoy doing
your
that sort of thing. But
Readers are waiting for you.
yeah, it's only recently that columns and fiction writing have come quite close in my. Very often, the things that I think fiction can't contain go into my non-fiction. So over the last 4 or 5 years, I have done more of that. Sort of not necessarily a memoir, but travelogue or recollection of someone I've loved and lost. Not loved romantically, but with respect.
A collection of essays on non-fiction?
No, not yet. No. The idea has come about once or twice, but no. Somebody would have to do it for me, collect them for me, I think. Some young, aspiring academic, maybe. Any
questions, comments?
I think both of you can just pitch in when there isn't one.
Actually, I had a
Yeah.
question which I sort of, once I described you as a Pakistani Briton, and you took great umbrage, and you said, no, I'm a Karachi-born Londoner. Now, you've spoken about your relationship with London, with Karachi. What's your relationship with London?
What it is about London, I don't know. I like it very much, and there are things about it I even love. But some part of me always feels as if I'm waiting to take wing when I'm there. In Urdu, you say par tol rahe hain. I'm just always weighing my wings, Yeah. So, I can't say, what's that woman called who makes really ghastly films about Punjabis in Britain? And the terrible film about one day I met her somewhere about 20 years ago, and she said, Gurinder Chadda, for those of you who didn't hear. She comes up and she said, when you go away from London, then you really miss the EastEnders and cheesy what's it? And I said, what's a cheesy what's it? I've never heard of a cheesy what's it. So no, I don't have that kind of nostalgia. If you ask me just now about what I miss about London, it won't be very different from what I miss about Karachi. No, it will be. I miss my friends, I miss my books, but the weather a bit. Yeah, sometimes when I go back from very hot weather, I enjoy the cool there. I enjoy the water and the green, and I enjoy the books and the book world. Meaning the world of books in the sense of libraries and bookshops, not necessarily book parties, because I think you get more of those here actually. But
So you enjoy the London bookshops, because I remember all my trips to bookshops, and you would tell me where to look for particular books.
one of the last times we did something like a 2.5-mile walk in search of the books you wanted. Yeah.
So can I ask you, while some people are looking for questions, an indiscreet kind of question?
Yeah.
Can you talk about what you're planning to do next? Or are there stories or a novel or essays?
At the moment, what am I planning to do? I'm planning to do an Urdu collection, I think, to put together my Urdu stories and add some more to them. I think, that's what I'm hoping to. But I'm not sure. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So, but when you finish a book, I don't know how many writers in the room might feel that. Once you finish the book, you do feel a bit attached to the book you've just finished and drained as well. So, you look forward to that time when you won't be writing, or you won't be kind of persecuted by the writing bug, chased by the writing bug. Because I have absolutely no urgency or no need to write every day, or it's not a part of it's not a vital part of my existence. It's something I do for pleasure. It's something I do as a duty sometimes, very often as a duty. But it's not something that actually makes me, it's not what keeps me alive. I can contemplate the day that I wouldn't be writing anymore, quite happily.
Any more questions from the audience? Yes, please. Can somebody pass the mic to you?
I'm intending to translate English autobiography of Mir into Baluchi, but I don't have such habit to run this thing myself. Can you suggest how can I make writing habit and
A writing habit, I guess each writer has a very different way of being, but mine is that I start writing as soon as I open my eyes, which is usually between 6 and 7 in the morning. And it can be earlier when I'm writing. And I just keep going for about 4 hours. And then if I need to stop, I just stop for the rest of the day. But I think in those early hours when you wake up, I certainly feel you can achieve a lot. Some people write all night. I couldn't do that at all. I mean, once the sun's set, I don't want to write at all. Once you've done that, I think editing can be done at any time at all. Once you have the written page, then spend any time at all that you get looking at it, revising it, cutting it, polishing it, etc. But for me, I'm a morning writer. Does anybody else in the room have other habits or that they might want to share? Yes.
Like you have spent a good time both in Karachi and Madras.
Madras, no.
So,
No, I've never been in Madras.
like, if you say, like, because I have like read somewhere in your stories that you have, when you mentioned Madras.
I was at school in Uti, which is in Tamil Nadu, yeah.
So
Madras.
how you see the transformation of Tamil Nadu or Madras, from Madras to Chennai, and the transformation of Karachi being a liberal town to become like a fundamentalist town, was more conservative?
I only passed through Chennai one day, and I was 13. I remember it, but I mean, I never got to know the city. My points of departure were Coimbatore and Bangalore, and I was going to the other parts of India. And apparently Bangalore has become a thriving metropolis. It was a pretty and quite sleepy city at the time I was there. Yeah.
So maybe we can begin by thanking Aamer and thanking the audience who have been here, listening to all these questions very patiently. I hope you enjoyed it, and the book is available here. Those of you who would like to have their copies signed, the author is also available, only for a few more days in Karachi. On this,
I leave for Hyderabad tomorrow, then I come back on Friday, and then I'm here for another day.
but I hope to see you again in Karachi with another book in not too distant a future.